The silence in Eleanor's new apartment was a physical presence, a thick, heavy blanket that seemed to absorb all sound and life. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of the life she had left behind, the constant hum of arguments, the slamming of doors, the painful, echoing silence that had eventually settled between her and the person she thought she'd spend forever with. This new quiet in her small unit in the old district of Manila was supposed to be a balm, a clean slate upon which she could slowly, carefully rewrite her story. But after 3 weeks, the bare white walls and the sparse, functional furniture she'd acquired felt less like a minimalist sanctuary and more like an empty cell. The emptiness of the space was a relentless mirror of the hollowed-out feeling inside her, and the solitude she had initially craved was beginning to curdle into a profound and unsettling loneliness. It was this deep-seated need to fill the void, to inject some semblance of history and warmth into the sterile newness of her existence that led her to wander the labyrinthine streets of the city's older quarters, her eyes scanning the shop fronts for something, anything, that felt like it had a soul. She found it, or perhaps it found her, tucked away in a narrow, shadow-drenched alley that seemed to exist in a different century. The sign above the door was so faded it was almost illegible. The words "memories" and "curios" carved into a warped piece of wood that creaked ominously in the faint breeze. The windows were grimy, layered with the dust of decades, making it impossible to see inside. A faint, almost magnetic pull urged her forward. The bell above the door didn't so much chime as emit a weak, bronchial rattle as she pushed it open, a sound that seemed to signal her intrusion into a place that preferred to be left alone. The air that hit her was a complex symphony of smells. The rich, sweet scent of aged mahogany and teak, the dry, papery smell of countless old books, the faint, metallic tang of tarnishing silver, and underpinning it all, the subtle, sweetish odor of decay, of things slowly returning to dust. Her eyes took a moment to adjust to the gloom, the only light filtering in from the dirty windows and a single bare bulb hanging over a cluttered counter at the back of the long, narrow shop. The place was a chaotic museum of forgotten lives. Towers of books threatened to avalanche onto piles of yellowed sheet music. Glass cabinets were crammed with mismatched porcelain, tarnished silverware, and collections of buttons and thimbles. Furniture from every era was stacked haphazardly, their surfaces covered in the fine gray felt of dust. It was overwhelming, a testament to the sheer weight of the past. And for a moment, Eleanor felt claustrophobic, the weight of all these abandoned memories pressing in on her. She was about to turn and leave when a glint of something caught her eye. On a high shelf, nestled between a tarnished brass astrolabe and a moth-eaten stuffed parakeet under a glass dome, was a doll. It was so perfectly placed, it seemed almost staged, a single spot of delicate beauty amidst the jumble. Without fully understanding why, Eleanor was drawn to it, weaving her way through the narrow aisles until she stood beneath it. She had to stand on her toes to carefully lift it down, its weight surprising her, feeling more substantial than its delicate form suggested. Cradling it in her hands, she felt a strange thrill, a connection that was immediate and inexplicable. It was a work of art. Its face was made of the finest bisque porcelain, with a flawless, creamy complexion that was still delicately blushed on the cheeks and lips. The lips themselves were painted a perfect rosebud red, parted slightly as if about to speak. But the eyes, that commanded attention. They were large and glassy, of a deep, mesmerizing violet, an unusual and striking color. They weren't blank like most dolls' eyes. They seemed to possess a deep, knowing intelligence, and as Eleanor shifted her weight, they seemed to track her movement, following her with an unsettling, lifelike precision. The doll was dressed in a gown of ivory lace and faded satin, finely detailed but yellowed with age, and its hands, also made of porcelain, were exquisitely articulated, the fingers curled slightly as if they had just released something or were waiting to grasp it. Tied around its slender wrist with a frayed, yellowed piece of silk ribbon was a small, yellow tag. In faded, elegant script, a single name was written: Isadora. The name suited it, evoking a sense of timeless grace and mystery. Eleanor was utterly captivated. She wasn't a collector. She knew nothing about dolls. But this felt different. This felt like fate. She carried Isadora to the counter at the back of the shop, where an ancient man seemed to materialize from the shadows. His face was a roadmap of deep wrinkles, and his eyes were milky with cataracts. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion. His gnarled, age-spotted fingers trembled slightly as he took the doll from her, not to examine it for a price, but to hold it, his touch surprisingly gentle, almost reverent. He didn't look at Eleanor. His clouded gaze remained fixed on the doll's porcelain face. "This one," he murmured, his voice a dry rustle like pages turning, "has stayed with me a long time." He fell silent for a long moment, as if listening to something only he could hear. "Old things," he said, his voice low and serious, "they hold on to their stories. Sometimes the stories are peaceful. Sometimes they are not so quiet." He looked up at her then, and despite the milky veil over his eyes, Eleanor felt the full weight of his gaze. "Are you sure you wish to take this story home?" A shiver, completely unrelated to the shop's cool air, traced a path down Eleanor's spine. But the feeling was fleeting, quickly overpowered by the powerful sense of connection she felt to the doll. She needed this. She needed something beautiful to care for, something with a history to fill her empty present. She nodded firmly, insisting. The old man's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly, a gesture of resignation. He wrapped the doll in brittle, brown paper, his movements slow and deliberate, and placed it carefully in a small box. As he handed it over and took her money, his hand lingered on the box for a second too long. "Mind the whispers," he mumbled, almost to himself. Eleanor, her heart light with the excitement of her find, barely heard him. She clutched the box to her chest and stepped out of the dusty gloom of the shop and into the fading afternoon light, feeling for the first time in months that she was not entirely alone. She placed Isadora on the mantelpiece in her living room, the centerpiece of the barren room. The doll's violet eyes stared out across the apartment, a beautiful, silent sentinel, watching and waiting. For the first 2 days, the presence of the doll, Isadora, was a source of genuine comfort to Eleanor. She would find herself talking to it as she moved about the apartment, filling the oppressive silence with her own voice, pretending the doll's serene porcelain expression was one of understanding and companionship. "What do you think, Isadora? Should I put the plant here? Or, quite a view, isn't it? Not much, but it's ours." It was a game she played to stave off the loneliness, and the doll, in its beautiful, silent passivity, was the perfect audience. The initial strange shiver she'd felt in the curio shop and the shopkeeper's cryptic warning had faded into the background, dismissed as the product of an overactive imagination fueled by the shop's spooky atmosphere. The third night, however, marked a subtle but irrevocable shift. Eleanor was curled on her sofa, a book open but largely unread on her lap, her mind wandering more than her eyes were reading. The apartment was steeped in the deep quiet of the late hour, broken only by the occasional groan of the old building's plumbing or the distant, muffled sound of traffic from the main road. It was then that she heard it. A sound so faint, it was barely a sound at all, more a vibration in the air, a tactile sensation at the very edge of perception. It was a soft, sighing exhalation, a susurration that seemed to weave through the room like a ghostly thread. She paused, her body tensing slightly, and held her breath, straining her ears against the silence. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then it came again, slightly louder this time. It wasn't a random noise, it had a shape, a cadence that suggested intention, like someone trying to form a word just beyond the range of hearing. Her eyes, almost of their own volition, were drawn to the mantelpiece. Isadora sat in her usual place, a silhouette against the pale wall, her features softened by the dim light of the single lamp. Nothing had changed. Eleanor let out the breath she'd been holding, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Getting spooked by the quiet, are we?" she chided herself aloud, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the room. She attributed the sound to the wind outside, though the window was closed, or to the settling of the old building, though it had not sounded like any settling she'd heard before. The following evening, the experience repeated itself, but the veil between the possible and the impossible grew thinner. She was preparing a simple dinner in her small kitchen, the sounds of clinking cutlery and running water filling the space. When she turned off the tap, the silence rushed back in, and with it, the sound. This time, it was unmistakably a whisper. It was faint, distant, as if coming from another room, but the tone was clear, a soft feminine sigh that carried a weight of profound sadness. A cold knot tightened in Eleanor's stomach. This was no trick of the building. Slowly, her heart beginning to hammer a nervous rhythm against her ribs, she walked into the living room. The room was empty, just as she had left it. Her gaze was fixed on the doll. Isadora Adder moved. Her delicate hands were still folded in her lap, her head tilted at its gentle, innocent angle. The rosebud lips were sealed. "Hello?" Eleanor's own voice was a whisper now, a tentative, foolish question posed to the empty air. The silence that answered felt heavy, watchful. She took another step closer to the mantelpiece, her eyes scanning the doll for any sign, any logical explanation. Perhaps it was a trick of acoustics from a neighbor's television, but the voice had been too clear, too intimate. She reached out, her finger trembling slightly, and touched the doll's cold, smooth hand. The porcelain was icy, a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to leach the warmth from her own skin. She snatched her hand back. As she did, the whisper came again, but this time it didn't come from across the room. It originated from a point just behind her right ear, so close and so clear that she could feel the faint, chilling displacement of air against her skin. It was a soft, sighing exhalation, a whisper that seemed to weave through the room like a ghostly thread. It was a single, perfectly enunciated word, imbued with a bottomless well of loneliness. Alone. Eleanor spun around, a gasp caught in her throat, her eyes wide with the primal fear. The space behind her was empty. She was, as the voice had so accurately stated, completely and utterly alone. But the word hung in the air, echoing in the silence of the apartment, and more terrifyingly, in the confines of her own mind. The cold dread that had been a fleeting visitor now took up permanent residence in the pit of her stomach. This was no longer a game, no longer a product of loneliness or imagination. The doll was not an inanimate object. It was aware, and it was communicating. The beautiful sentinel on the mantelpiece was a prison for something else, and the first cracks in its silence had begun to seep into Eleanor's world. The whispers did not cease after that first clear, chilling word. Instead, they became a constant, low-grade soundtrack to Eleanor's existence, a sinister parasite feeding on the silence of her apartment. They were rarely full sentences, more often fragments of emotion-laden words that slithered into her consciousness, whether she was awake or teetering on the edge of sleep. "Betrayal," a voice would sigh from an empty corner. "Alone," another would moan from the kitchen doorway. "Why did he—" "Forever in darkness." The tones varied. Sometimes a young woman's sob, other times an older, more bitter rasp. But they all carried the same undercurrent of profound sorrow and a seething, unresolved anger. Eleanor stopped using the living room in the evenings, choosing to stay in her bedroom with the door firmly shut. But the whispers were undeterred by mere doors. They seeped through the gap under it, a faint, maddening hiss that made concentration impossible and peace a distant memory. She found herself jumping at every small sound, her nerves frayed to breaking point, her lack of sleep painting dark circles under her eyes. The beautiful doll on the mantelpiece was no longer a source of comfort. It was the clear, terrifying epicenter of this auditory haunting, its violet eyes seeming to glow with a faint, malicious light in the twilight. Exhaustion eventually became her undoing. On the fifth night, she fell into a fitful, feverish sleep on her sofa, too drained to even make it to her bed. Her dreams were not her own. They were vivid, saturated with a clarity and sensory detail that felt more like memories, but memories of a life she had never lived. She was standing in the grand, airy parlor of a magnificent ancestral home, the kind she had only seen in history books. The air smelled of polish and sampaguita blossoms. She was wearing a stunning, though uncomfortably tight, terno dress from the turn of the century, the butterfly sleeves delicate and imposing. In her dream hands, her fingers, slim and elegant, were clasped by a handsome, charismatic man with slicked-back hair and a charming, confident smile. He was whispering to her, his words sweet and intoxicating, promises of a future filled with love and luxury. But a deep, instinctual dread coiled in her stomach, a feeling entirely separate from the dream Eleanor's apparent giddiness. The man's eyes, for all their apparent warmth, held a calculating coldness that his smile could not mask. Then the dream shattered and reformed with a violent lurch. She was no longer in the bright parlor, but in a small, dimly lit bedroom, choking on silent sobs. The same handsome man was there, but his charm had evaporated, replaced by a visage of cruel indifference. He was tearing a bundle of letters from her grasp, his movements rough and dismissive. She could feel the rough parchment of the paper, see the familiar, looping handwriting on the envelopes, her father's handwriting. The man's lips were moving, spitting venomous words she couldn't quite hear over the roaring in her ears. Words that spoke of lies, of a foolish, trusting heart, of a business deal now ruined. He threw the letters into a small fireplace, and Eleanor watched, helpless, as the flames licked hungrily at the paper, curling the edges black, consuming the words, the promises, the last vestiges of her family's security. The heat from the flames felt intensely, painfully real on her skin. She woke with a violent start, bolting upright on the sofa, a scream trapped in her raw throat. Her face was wet with tears, but they were not tears of her present-day sorrow. They were the hot, bitter tears of Isidore's century-old heartbreak. She was gasping for air, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The room was freezing cold, a deep, unnatural chill that had not been there when she fell asleep. Shaking uncontrollably, she wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stumbled out of the living room, unable to stop herself from looking toward the mantelpiece. Isidore was there, a pale specter in the moonlight filtering through the window. But something was different. The doll's head, which always sat perfectly straight, was now tilted ever so slightly to the side, giving her a quizzical, almost pitying look. And there, clutched in her delicate porcelain fingers, was something that made Eleanor's blood run cold. It was a small, triangular piece of paper,
its edges charred and blackened as if it had been plucked from a fire. It hadn't been there before she fell asleep. With a trembling hand, she approached and gently pried it from the doll's cold grasp. On the fragment, she could make out a few words of elegant, faded script. "My dearest Isadora, do not trust his—" The rest was burned away. This was no longer just about whispers or bad dreams. The spirit in the doll was not merely replaying its past, it was physically manifesting its memories, pulling artifacts of its trauma into Eleanor's present. The veil between her reality and Isadora's nightmare was not just thinning, it was being torn apart, and Eleanor was now a terrified participant trapped on the wrong side of history.
The charred fragment of paper felt like a live ember in Eleanor's hand, its existence an impossible, terrifying proof that the haunting had escalated beyond auditory hallucinations and into the realm of the physically tangible. The whispered pleas and the visceral nightmare had been bad enough, but this was evidence. It was a message, a piece of a story that demanded to be understood. The fear that had frozen her in place slowly began to thaw, replaced by a burning, compulsive need for answers. Who was Isadora? What had happened to her? The answers, she felt certain, were the only possible key to unlocking the nightmare and freeing herself from it. The name Isadora was unusual, and the doll's clothing, from what she could recall of her dream, suggested a specific era. This was her starting point. The following morning, armed with the desperate purpose that overrode her exhaustion, Eleanor went to the Manila Public Library, a grand old building that itself felt like a repository of forgotten stories. The air inside was cool and smelled of aging paper and polished wood, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the city outside. She found a secluded carrel in the historical archive section, the silence there feeling heavy and scholarly rather than menacing. She started with digital newspaper databases, her fingers trembling as she typed the name Isadora de la Cruz into the search field. The results were sparse at first, mere snippets from society pages. But then she found a photograph. It was from a 1912 Society newsletter, slightly blurred with age but unmistakable. It showed a young woman of breathtaking beauty, her hair styled in an elaborate coiffure, her neck adorned with pearls, her eyes, even in grainy black and white, seeming to hold a confident, intelligent light. The caption read, "Miss Isadora de la Cruz, daughter of esteemed merchant Don Rafael de la Cruz, noted for her grace and her unparalleled collection of French bisque dolls, is once again the belle of the ball at the Manila Hotel's summer soiree." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This was her, the woman from her dream, the owner of the voice that now whispered in her apartment. Seeing her as a real living person, vibrant and full of life, made the tragedy she sensed all the more acute. She spent hours combing through every mention, building a picture of a privileged, celebrated life. Isadora was frequently mentioned alongside her father, a powerful and respected figure in the import-export business. Then, the mentions suddenly changed. The society pages grew silent about her. The cheerful announcements of her engagements at various events ceased. In their place, Eleanor found a single, brief article from a different, less reputable publication, tucked away in a digital corner reserved for scandal. The headline was vague but ominous. "A broken engagement. Daughter of prominent family recluse after foreign suitor's sudden departure." The language was flowery and dramatic, but the core of the story aligned perfectly with the nightmare Eleanor had endured. The burning letters, the feeling of devastating betrayal. The final piece of the puzzle was the hardest to find. It was a simple, short obituary from 1915, just 3 years after the society photo was taken. Isadora de la Cruz, beloved daughter of Don Rafael de la Cruz, passed from this life after a brief illness. She is remembered for her kind heart and her artistic spirit. The family has requested privacy in their time of grief. There was no mention of a husband or children. The cause of death was left respectfully vague, but a later gossipy editorial column from the era, which Eleanor found by cross-referencing dates, was less kind. It cruelly speculated that the once celebrated beauty had died of a broken heart, a recluse in her own home, surrounded only by the dolls she cherished more than people. Eleanor sat back in her hard wooden chair, the glow of the computer screen the only light in the dim carrel.
The whispers, the emotions, the nightmare, it all made a terrible, heartbreaking sense. The spirit tethered to the doll wasn't merely a malevolent force, it was an echo of a profound, personal tragedy. Isadora's spirit was trapped in a cycle of grief, betrayal, and a thirst for vengeance that had festered for over a century, its rage and sorrow perfectly preserved in the porcelain shell of her most cherished possession. The doll wasn't just haunted, it was a prison for a soul that had never found peace, a soul that had been wronged in the most intimate and devastating way imaginable. Eleanor felt a shocking wave of pity wash over her, momentarily diluting her fear. She understood now. The whispers of betrayal and why were not threats aimed at her. They were the constant, agonized refrain of a story that had been cruelly cut short, a record forever skipping at its most painful moment. She left the library as the sun was setting, the weight of Isadora's history feeling heavier than the doll itself. She now knew the source of the haunting, but understanding the storm did nothing to stop its raging. If anything, she now felt its winds more keenly than ever before.
Armed with the tragic, intimate history of the soul trapped within the porcelain doll, Eleanor returned to her apartment feeling a seismic shift in her own emotions. The primal, skin-crawling fear was still there, a constant cold hum in the background of her nerves, but it was now overshadowed by an overwhelming and profound sense of pity. The whispers that greeted her as she stepped inside, the same fragmented, sorrowful litany of betrayal, alone, why, no longer sounded like the threats of a monstrous entity. They now sounded like the cries of a wounded animal, the echoes of a pain so deep and personal it had transcended death itself. She looked at Isadora on the mantelpiece not as a monster, but as a kindred spirit, another woman whose life had been shattered by a man's cruelty. In a moment of impulsive, perhaps foolish empathy, Eleanor approached the doll. Her heart was pounding, but not solely from fear. It was from a desperate need to connect, to offer some form of solace across the unimaginable gulf of time that separated them. "Isadora," she began, her voice soft and trembling, filled with the sincerity that brought fresh tears to her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I read about what happened to you. I'm so incredibly sorry for what he did to you, to your family." She spoke as if to a friend, her words spilling out in a compassionate rush. "He's gone. He can't hurt you anymore. Whatever he took, whoever he was, he's gone. You can rest now. You can let go. You don't have to be trapped here anymore." The reaction was not the peaceful release she had naively hoped for. It was instantaneous and violently apocalyptic. The air in the room, once merely cold, became a solid, suffocating block of ice that seemed to press against her skin and crush the air from her lungs. The whispering, usually a disjointed background noise, erupted into a deafening, overlapping crescendo of pure, undiluted rage. It was no longer a single voice, but a chorus of fury, a symphony of betrayal that screamed inside her skull. Lies, deceit, he must know, he must feel. The words were not just heard, they were felt, like shards of glass scraping against her mind. The lamp on the side table flickered, once, twice, and then died with the faint pop, plunging the room into a darkness so absolute it felt like being swallowed whole. At the same moment, a wind, impossible in the sealed apartment, exploded through the room, a freezing gale that tore papers from the table and sent a vase of flowers crashing to the floor. Eleanor felt a physical pressure, immense and invisible, slam into her chest, throwing her backward onto the sofa with a force that knocked the wind from her. She tried to scream, to call for help that would never come, but her voice was gone, stolen by the oppressive entity that now filled the space. This was not the sadness of a broken heart. This was the hurricane of a wrath that had been festering for a century. And then the true assault began. She felt a presence, a cold, intelligent, and utterly malicious force push against the boundaries of her own consciousness. It was not trying to communicate, it was trying to evict.
Visions, more vivid and terrifying than any dream, slammed into her with the force of physical blows. Alistair Finch's handsome face contorted in a cruel, mocking laugh. The feel of the precious letters being ripped from her grasp. The searing heat of the flames as they consumed her father's words. The soul-crushing desolation of being utterly ruined and alone. These were not memories she was observing. They were being forced into her, imprinted on her mind as if they were her own. The spirit did not want her comfort. It scorned her pity. It saw her empathy not as an offering of peace, but as a weakness to be exploited, an open door it could now storm through. It wanted a vessel. It wanted hands that could hold a knife, a voice that could scream accusations, a body that could travel through the modern world to find the bloodline of the man who had destroyed it and finish its unfinished business. Eleanor fought back with a terror that was purely instinctual, a primal battle for the very ownership of herself. She clawed at her own mind, focusing on her own memories, her name, her face in the mirror, the feel of her own hands. Anything to anchor herself in her own identity against the tidal wave of Isadora's vengeful consciousness. It was a silent, desperate war waged on the battlefield of her soul. Just as she felt her grip slipping, her sense of self beginning to dissolve into the other's ancient hatred, the assault ceased, as suddenly as it had begun. The wind died, the pressure vanished. The room was silent and still save for her own ragged, sobbing breaths. Weakly, she looked toward the mantelpiece, her vision blurry with tears of terror. The doll had not moved from its spot, but its head had turned. It was no longer staring out at the room, it was staring directly at her, its violet eyes seeming to glow with a faint, malevolent, and utterly triumphant light in the deep darkness of the room. The message was clear. Her attempt at compassion had been a catastrophic error. She had not quieted the spirit. She had invited it in.